When I turned 50, I thought I had it figured out. At least, I thought I was supposed to. There's a strange pressure that creeps in around that age. Not loud, not direct, just this hum in the background, like an old refrigerator always running, reminding you that time is slipping, that if you haven't built your kingdom by now, maybe it was never meant to be built at all. At 50, I had a job with a title people respected. I had a house that looked nice on the outside. I had 2 kids who didn't need me quite as much as they used to, and a wife who, if I'm being honest, I'd stopped really looking at. Not because I didn't love her, but because I had started looking at myself too much, and not in a flattering way. Back then, I wore a tired kind of pride. The kind that says, I'm holding everything together, when inside, you're not quite sure what's even worth holding on to anymore. One morning, I remember it was autumn, crisp and sharp. I sat in my car before going into work, and I just stared at the steering wheel. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It wasn't anger either. It was something colder, emptier, like being in a hallway after the party's over. Cups still on the table. Music off. You just stand there, unsure of whether to clean up or walk away. Looking back now, I see what I couldn't then. I was grieving the version of myself I thought I was supposed to become. And no one warns you about that. You hear people talk about the midlife crisis, like it's some cliche involving a sports car or a bad haircut. But it's quieter than that. It's the ache of realizing you climbed a ladder that might have been leaning on the wrong wall. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not because of stress, but because of a question that wouldn't let go. Is this it? And the silence that followed was more terrifying than any answer. I used to tell myself that pushing through was noble, that staying busy was the cure. But busyness is just another kind of hiding, isn't it? A tidy distraction from asking real questions. At 50, I didn't know how to rest. I knew how to pause between obligations. But rest, the kind that heals? I had no idea how to do that. I associated rest with laziness or worse, with weakness. So I kept going faster, harder, louder. But something began to crack. Not all at once. Slowly, like water under a rock. My relationship with my son started shifting first. He was 24 then, and bold in all the ways I had once been. He asked questions I didn't want to answer. He noticed when I laughed without joy. One night over dinner, he said to me, "You seem somewhere else lately," and I snapped. Told him I was fine. Told him to worry about his own life. But the truth? He saw me more clearly than I did. It's funny how the people closest to you can become mirrors you refuse to look into. At work, I was praised. Reliable, they said. Solid. But I felt like a man on autopilot. My ideas were stale, my motivation thin. I used to feel things deeply, music, nature, even silence. But by then, even joy had become muted. Like someone had turned the volume down on life. And then came the day I missed my wedding anniversary. Completely. No card. No flowers. Just a forgotten date. When I saw the look in her eyes, the quiet disappointment of someone who no longer expects you to show up, it cut deeper than any argument. That night, I sat in the garage in the dark, and I cried. I was 51, a grown man, a provider, and yet I felt more like a ghost than a person, drifting through the life I'd built with no clear door back in. You see, failure at 50 doesn't always look like disaster. Sometimes it looks like disconnection from your family, yourself, even God. I had always thought faith was something you either had or didn't. But I've come to understand, sometimes you lose it for a while, not out of rebellion, but out of fatigue. You stop hearing him, not because he stopped speaking, but because the noise inside you got too loud. I stopped praying, not because I stopped believing, but because I didn't know what to say anymore. All the old words felt empty. All the new ones got stuck in my throat. But grace is stubborn. It waited for me. There was a morning, it must have been early spring. I took a walk alone, down a trail near the house. Birds were just beginning to return. Trees still bare, but hopeful. I remember a single beam of light coming through the branches, warming my hand. And in that simple moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks, Just a whisper. You're still here. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a plan. But it was enough to make me keep walking. And slowly, so slowly, I began to realize something I wish I had known back then. Your worth isn't measured by how well you hold it all together. It's measured by how gently you learn to let go. I used to believe change had to be grand. You know, the movie kind. A breakthrough. A revelation. Something loud enough to drown out the past. But the truth? Change is quiet. It's a slow return to yourself. A coming home you barely recognize until you're standing at the door, hand on the knob, heart uncertain but ready. After that morning on the trail, nothing dramatic happened. My life didn't turn around overnight. My marriage was still strained. My job still drained me. But something had softened in me, like I'd stopped bracing for a storm that had already passed. I began listening more, not to people necessarily, to myself, to the spaces between thoughts. I started waking up 10 minutes earlier, just enough time to sit with a cup of coffee in silence. No news, no emails, just the sound of the morning. You'd be surprised how many truths live in those first quiet moments of the day. It was during one of those mornings that I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror across the kitchen. Not the surface, anyone can see wrinkles and gray, but something deeper. A tiredness in my eyes that wasn't from lack of sleep. A man carrying weight that didn't belong to him anymore. That's when it really began. The shedding. I started asking questions I hadn't let myself ask before. Like, why had I spent so much time trying to be impressive, rather than present? Why did I keep pretending I wasn't lonely, even in a house full of people? There's a certain kind of loneliness that hits hardest when you're surrounded. When the conversations are shallow. When your smiles are rehearsed. I used to think loneliness was something that happened to people who lived alone. But I had people, and still I felt unseen. And then came the guilt. For not being more grateful. For having so much, and still feeling like something was missing. But here's what I understand now. Emptiness doesn't always come from lack. Sometimes it comes from misalignment. I was living a life full of things I had said yes to out of fear. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of failing. Fear of becoming invisible. I had learned how to succeed by society's rules, but I had never learned how to live by my own. At work, I was offered a promotion. More money. More responsibility. More hours. I turned it down. People thought I was crazy. You're not getting any younger, they said. But that was exactly the point. I didn't want more, I wanted different. I started going on walks after dinner. My wife would sometimes join me, though we didn't always talk. Just the two of us, side by side again, like we used to be before life got so noisy. Some nights we said nothing at all. And still, somehow, those silences healed things words never could. One evening, she reached for my hand, just like that, after months of distance. No speech, no explanation, just a simple gesture that said, I see you, I still see you. I began writing too, nothing fancy, just thoughts scribbled into a notebook I kept by the bed. At first it felt pointless, but over time those words became a thread back to myself. I wrote what I was afraid to say out loud. I wrote memories I thought I'd forgotten. I wrote prayers I didn't know I still carried. And in those pages, I found someone I hadn't seen in a long time. He wasn't the ambitious, hard-charging man I tried to be at 50. He was gentler, quieter, but wiser, and more whole. I also started reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. Not because I wanted to fix the past, but because I didn't want to carry its weight anymore. One of those calls was to my brother. We hadn't spoken in almost a decade, over something so small I can't even recall what it was. Ego, probably. It usually is. When he answered, there was a pause. Then he said, I wondered if we'd ever get too old to be this stubborn. We both laughed. That kind of laugh that pulls something out of your chest and sets it down gently. We talked for hours. Not about the past, but about birds and retirement and the silly things our knees do now when it's cold. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need a speech. Just a willingness to make the first move. I didn't know it then, but I was learning the art of softening. Of choosing tenderness over being right. Of seeing love not as a reward, but as a daily practice. I stopped trying to be strong in the way I thought men had to be, the silent, stoic kind of strong. And instead, I let myself feel, not all at once, but enough to realize that grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. I grieved my younger self, not because he failed, but because he tried so hard to be someone he wasn't. I grieved the father I wasn't, the one who missed some soccer games, the one who worked late and called it duty. I see now that what my children needed wasn't just my effort, it was my attention. But the beautiful thing about growing older is this. As long as you're breathing, it's not too late to love better. I started calling my daughter more often, not to check in, but to listen, to hear about her long days, her doubts, her joy. She once said, "You sound different, Dad." And I said, "I'm learning," because I was, and still am. If you're still here, leave me a comment. I want to know if any of this has touched a part of you that hasn't had space to speak in a while. We carry so much silently. It's good to let some of it breathe. There's something no one tells you about aging. It's not just about the body getting slower. It's about the shedding of roles, of identities, of all the costumes you wore without realizing they were never truly yours. At 50, I still thought I had to earn my place every day. In my job, in my home, even in my own skin. I was a manager, a husband, a father, a provider. Each word like a badge I had pinned to my chest. Proudly, yes, but also fearfully. Because what happens if one of those badges gets torn off? What if the job ends? What if the kids grow up and don't need you? What if the house goes quiet? No one warns you how deeply those questions can haunt a man who's built his worth on being needed. There was a particular morning. I must have been 52, when I looked across the breakfast table at my wife and realized I didn't know how to just be with her anymore. We were good teammates, efficient, kind, but the spark that once made our eyes linger on each other had faded. Not gone, but buried. And it scared me, because I realized I'd spent so many years being useful that I'd forgotten how to be vulnerable. I knew how to fix a leaky faucet, how to balance the checkbook, how to discipline the kids when they crossed a line. But I didn't know how to say, "I'm afraid I don't know who I am anymore." There's a special kind of loneliness in being surrounded by people who love you, but not knowing how to let them see you fully. I remember taking a weekend away by myself, not to escape, but to think. I booked a small cabin, brought a notebook, left my phone off. The first day I couldn't sit still. I paced. I read the same page of a book 6 times. I made coffee I didn't drink. My mind was loud, but by the second night, something inside me slowed. There was a moment. I was sitting by the window watching pine trees sway, and I heard a sentence float through my head like a soft whisper. "You're not what you do," startled me, because I'd never considered that before. Not really. I was what I did. That's what men are taught, right? We are our output, our performance, our results. But in that quiet space, I started to wonder, what if that's not true? What if I was worthy even without the titles, without the paychecks, without the usefulness? It was terrifying, and it was liberating. That weekend became a turning point. Not in the sense that I came home and quit everything, but in the sense that I stopped chasing approval like it was oxygen. I started letting go of the illusion that I had to constantly prove something, to my boss, to my neighbors, to myself. And that created room for stillness, room for softness, room for a deeper kind of listening. I began paying attention to little things again, the way sunlight spilled through the blinds in the morning, the way my wife tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way the house creaked after rain. I had missed these things for years. You see, when you're always trying to move forward, you forget to look around. You live in a future that never quite arrives, and the present slips through your fingers like sand. One afternoon, my son asked if I wanted to join him and his kids for a day at the lake. Normally, I would have hesitated, thought about work or yard chores or all the productive things I should be doing. But I didn't. I said yes, and we sat on that dock, skipping rocks and laughing at nothing in particular, and something inside me healed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet way that truth often arrives. That's when I realized The most important parts of life don't announce themselves. They whisper. They wait. They need you to slow down long enough to hear them. I used to fill every gap in my calendar out of fear. Empty space made me anxious. Now, I crave it. Not because I want to escape, but because I finally know how to be with myself without the noise. There's this story I remember from years ago about a monk who carried water up a mountain every day for the temple. One day, someone asked him, "Why don't you fix the broken pot you carry? It leaks most of the water before you reach the top." And the monk smiled. He said, "Look behind you. All along the path were flowers in full bloom. The water may not have made it to the top," he said, "but it brought life along the way." I think of that story often now, especially when I think of my 50s. There were mistakes, failures, moments I still wince at, things I wish I'd said, apologies I gave too late. But there was also love. There were lessons blooming quietly in places I didn't know I'd watered. And when I look back, I see now, it wasn't about reaching the top. It was about what grew along the way. There's something strange that happens when you start to face your own mortality. Not in the abstract, but in the quiet moments when you catch yourself thinking, I may not see how this story ends. In my 50s, I was still pretending time owed me something. There was always another year to make it right. Another chance to fix what I'd broken. Another morning to start over. I didn't rush to forgive, because I thought there would always be another tomorrow. But time is generous only when you treat it with humility. I remember standing in my father's hospital room. He was 84, quiet, his breath shallow but steady. The man who had once taught me how to ride a bike, who scolded me when I skipped school, who helped me fix my first leaky sink. He was small now, fragile in a way I wasn't prepared for. I held his hand. It was cold, and I realized in that moment, I'd never really asked him who he was. Not the man who raised me, the man before that, the boy who once dreamed, the young man who fell in love with my mother, the soldier who came home and never talked about it. We think we know our parents, but often we only know the parts of them that intersect with our own story. I stayed with him until he passed, quietly, like a candle going out in a room already full of shadows. Driving home that night, I didn't cry, not right away. I just felt hollow. But it wasn't grief alone. It was the weight of all the questions I never asked. All the silence I never broke. All the time I thought I had. That's when I started writing letters. Not emails. Letters. Real ones in ink on paper. I wrote to my children not to explain things but to tell them stories. Stories they'd never heard. About who I was before they were born. The fears I carried. The mistakes I made. The nights I doubted myself. The mornings I found strength anyway. I didn't want to leave this world without them knowing the man behind the father. You see, legacy isn't the money you leave behind. It's not your house or your name carved into a stone. It's the shape of your soul pressed into someone else's life. And too often, we hide that soul behind the armor of being strong. But strength doesn't inspire people. Vulnerability does. So I told them the truth, that I had failed at 50, not spectacularly but quietly, in the way I loved too cautiously, in the way I waited too long to listen, in the way I let pride hold the pen when humility was the better author. I told them about the friend I stopped calling because I couldn't admit I was wrong, the time I raised my voice when I should have offered a hug, the many Sundays I skipped family dinners just to catch up on work. They didn't need me to be perfect. They needed me to be real, and real means raw sometimes, messy, unresolved. Took me years to learn that the people who love you, they don't want your perfection. They want your presence. They want to know they matter more than your pride. My granddaughter asked me once, "Grandpa, were you ever afraid?" I smiled. "All the time, sweetheart." But I used to think fear was something to be hidden, that courage meant being fearless. Now I know courage just means showing up anyway, with trembling hands if you have to, with tearful eyes, with a voice that shakes, because when you show up like that, people feel safe enough to do the same. In my 50s, I had a hard time letting go of control. I clung to plans, to expectations, to how things should have been. But life is a wild thing. It doesn't ask for permission before it changes you. One day, a friend of mine, someone I'd known since college, got sick. The kind of sick that doesn't have a hopeful ending. I visited him every week. We didn't talk about death. We talked about books and bad TV shows and the sandwiches in the hospital cafeteria. One afternoon, he said, "You know what I miss most? Ordinary days." That sentence has never left me, because it's true. When you strip everything else away, what you crave most are the days that used to feel boring. The ones you didn't post about. The ones where nothing happened except breakfast with someone you love, or folding laundry while the sun came through the window. I started honoring those days more, noticing the shape of them, letting them soften me. There's a kind of peace that comes when you realize you don't need your life to be extraordinary. You just want it to be yours. And you want it to feel whole, not in a perfect sense, but in the way an old quilt feels whole. Worn, patched, but warm from every hand that ever touched it. I stopped making 5-year plans. I started making 5-minute ones. Like, I'll sit outside and listen to the wind. Or, I'll write a note to someone I miss. Or just, I'll make the good kind of tea today, even if no one else is home. It's funny, isn't it? How you spend the first half of life trying to make noise, trying to be seen, heard, respected. And the second half, you just want quiet that feels like love.